Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the second part of our exploration of the art of the 20th century. We'll call it modern too, but the term modern cannot really encompass all of the different movements and styles that emerged from this time. This painting is by the artist Paul Klee, and he was an abstract painter, but he followed the surrealist ideal of drawing into the unconscious mind to find inspiration for his work. As the 20th century unfolded, artists continued to diverge into a variety of styles that challenged the basic premises about what is meant by what we call a work of art. While there were so many new movements in the arts that we cannot cover them all here, we'll take a look at some of the major influences of this time. To begin, it's helpful to break the art into 3 or 4 currents that affected the whole movement. We'll start with abstraction, and this is defined as having only intrinsic form with little or no pictorial representation. What does that mean? Well, you could say it doesn't look like anything. It's just an abstraction. This was a response by artists to a world that seemed to be changing at its very roots. This is an exploration by the mind into the nature of reality. Expressionism has already come up in this course, and it has to do with the emotional content and response of the artist as they're painting and of the viewer. So expressionist work can usually touch us deeply and elicit an emotional response. Now we have fantasy, which addresses the world of the imagination, and realism presents the world around us in precise detail so that perhaps we may see it in a new way. And then there is this larger concept called modernism, which is constantly changing and is really just a concept. This image to the left is by Jasper Johns, and it dates from 1955. Interesting to note that he's working with encaustic, or melted wax, something that we saw way back in the Egyptian time. After World War II, the center of the art world moved from Paris to New York City. Many of the most influential artists in Europe had fled Nazi persecution, and they ended up in New York. As these varied artists all converged on the city, a movement called Abstract Expressionism was born. This art was influenced by the Expressionists, the Cubists, the Surrealists, and lots of other ists, ranging from advancements in technology to the rise of Zen Buddhism, of all things. Now, the abstract expressionists were influenced by all of these, but they were also intent on breaking conventions. They wanted to do something truly different. The artist Mark Rothko painted in a style called color field painting, in which the force of the colors are seen as more important than any images that he might put into the work. He did paint in a realistic style early in his career, but in the 50s he painted a series of canvases that were only squares of color, like we see here. The Work Projects Administration, also called the Farm Security Administration, gave money to artists to create public works, and this gave a boost to many artists who went on to become well known after the Great Depression. I will say that I hear some people's skepticism about the work of Rothko, like it's just a square. What's the deal? But standing in front of these paintings, if you ever have an opportunity to do that and really keep your mind open, you might find that there's something there, something that's really hard to explain. With these works, I do feel that the originals really have such more impact than looking at a print image as we're seeing here. In the spring of 1913, there was a show called the Armory Show held in New York, and this art show introduced new styles of art to the American public. The work that had been happening in Europe and somewhat in U.S. got all consolidated with over 1,600 works in this show. Now, the show was met with hostility when it first opened, though even now it is seen as the true beginning of the modern art movement in this country. The Armory show is considered the pivotal time where it all started, 1913. So let's look at one more abstract painter, and that would be the pioneer of modernism was the Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky. Now he was a successful lawyer, and then he saw Monet's haystacks, and it rocked his world. He was so moved by the piece that he gave up his position as a professor of law and he dedicated himself to the study of art. Now, Kandinsky was strongly influenced by the early Expressionists and he used symbolism in his work, but he was primarily interested in the sheer force of color and how it impacted the viewer. This image that we see here is typical of many of his works, so it's got abstraction, but there is some kind of movement here. Another abstract expressionist painter was the artist Barnett Newman, and he primarily created those large color field paintings like we see with Mark Rothko, but he was also a sculptor. And through his sculptural works, Newman wanted to communicate the isolation of modern humanity's lonely condition. This sculpture was conceived and created between 1963 and 1967. Think about all that was going on in this country and in the world at this time. So for his sculpture, he used the image of an Egyptian pyramid to portray humankind's spiritual aspirations. Now that's pretty profound when you think about the fact that the pyramid-like structure appears in almost all societies around the globe since ancient times. And the pyramids themselves were supposed to represent rays reaching up to the sun. So this represents the humanity's spiritual aspirations. And the broken top of the obelisk up here is supposed to represent how these aspirations have been undermined by the materialism and speed of the 20th century. In a hopeful twist, Barnett Newman has these two worlds meeting in a delicate balance. This version of the sculpture is installed outside the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and it's dedicated to the memory of Martin Luther King, who was shot in 1968, soon after this work was completed. Now let's look at mobiles. Many of you might think that we've always had things hanging on strings like you see in a baby's crib, but no, somebody had to make the first one. And that guy would have been Alexander Calder. He called these kinetic sculptures, or sculptures that were in motion, constantly changing as they responded to the airflow around them. These sculptures were made primarily of metal, but he also used wire, rope, and found objects. They were given the name mobile by the artist Marcel Duchamp. Now the term mobile and the concept of this kind of sculpture is very familiar, but it all started with this guy working in the middle of the 20th century. His work is primarily abstract, and he also often injects a little bit of humor into his pieces. This one is called Fish Swimming Above a Lobster Trap. Hey, but what else did this guy do? Let's check it out. Well, on the right, we have his Flamingo of 1974. You know, I like this piece because it's such a classic 1970s large-scale metal sculpture. It's abstract, it's brightly painted, it's sort of incongruous with its environment, and this was really the primary movement in sculpture in the 1970s. But these things, I find them pretty cool. He also did these wire sculptures. Now check out the Bobby below, the cop, the policeman. You see how he's left all this information out, and yet the viewer is still able to fill it in and to see what the story is that he's telling here. Now what about op art? Op art is art that kind of tricks the eye. Usually the artists manipulate light and dark. They contrast colors or patterns in order to challenge our visual perceptions. This style of art was very popular in the 1960s, as this painting by Richard Aniskowitz shows. If you stare at this often enough, no, excuse me, if you stare at it long enough and then you stare at a wall, you'll see an imprint. But over here is just simple optical illusion. See these balls? Guess what? They're the same size. It's only the checkerboard that makes the one seem larger. So while this style of art, op art, has a kind of a hard-edged geometric feel, let's go in a different direction with the next few slides and look at German Expressionism. Now this style started in the early 20th century as the tensions were simmering in Europe prior to World War I. The unsettled atmosphere that was all about them came out through these artists' work. These expressionists were also friends or familiar with the work of the Fauvists. They were the wild beasts of color that we talked about last week. And you can see this in some of the work, like here. They also believed that humanity was changing in dramatic ways and that their art was a bridge to the new era. One of the schools of German Expressionism was called Der Bruch. What does that mean? The bridge. And that would be literally that this art was the bridge to the new means of expression. One group of expressionists came together after World War I, was comprised of artists who had been soldiers in the war. Their art reflected the challenge of war, and they sought to present what they called the new objectivity, or some kind of true art that went beyond like and dislike. Juan Miró was friends with many of the German expressionists and surrealist painters, although he did not want to identify with any group. He used the power of accident to guide his paintings, believing that this gave him access to the unconscious mind. So he would start painting by trying to set up accidents, happenstance, and had with no plan also. And then he would see what the images suggested to him. Now after this, he would be very precise in how he executed the work, but he was only doing the work that he saw based on accident. Now, I wonder if any of you are getting thirsty. Do you think, just think about if you wanted to get a nice sip of something, it probably would not be from the fur cup. This is a classic piece, and quite frankly, I think it's wonderful. It just makes you want to go pfft, pfft. But another great thing about it is that Merit Oppenheim was a woman, and we haven't seen so many women in the art field, as it's harder for women to find their way. At least it was in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. Another woman who made quite a mark on the world was Margaret Bourke-White. She was a photographer for Fortune magazine and in the early years of Life magazine. Her images are ubiquitous. We've seen them everywhere. Now this is, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, and is one of the really more famous pictures of him. It's interesting to look at this little man and think about how he really changed the world by his actions and inspired Martin Luther King, actually. Another photographer that we can look at would be Edward Weston. I got to say, I really like this guy's work because what he does is he looks at the world around us and then he finds ways of presenting it that are different than our habitual ways of seeing. He also has many beautiful photographs of the human body where he'll just come into one part and turn it into an abstraction, but maybe it's an arm or a leg or something like that. Now, another photographer that we've looked at before would be Dorothea Lange. She was part of the Works Projects or the Farm Security Administration. It went by both names. And she took photographs of migrant workers during the Great Depression. One thing I want to point out here is that she has a very famous photograph of a migrant mother and child. Well, this is her. And these are the two kids that were in the photograph. So while this is happening in the United States, let's go south to Mexico. In Mexico during the early to mid 20th century, there was a lot of political upheaval. The communists were rising. There was just a lot of instability in Mexico. And at the same time, there was a great school of muralist artists. Diego Rivera was one of the best known. And what I'm showing you here are actually paintings of his rather than the murals because they're harder to see. But I want you to notice in both of these paintings the style of this artist. The one on the right is so beautiful in its simplicity. It's also got a centered form in the middle, which is something that we don't often do in the arts because it can make it look like a religious icon. But in this case, it sort of is a religious icon. It's quite beautiful. You can see the Easter lilies, even the shape of the cross here. It's a very beautiful painting, I think. And then same with this one on the left. I find it quite striking. Okay, so he was a Mexican muralist. There was a whole school of Mexican muralists. And if I had all night, I would spend the rest of the lesson talking about them. But you know what? We're going to move to the Harlem Renaissance. Jacob Lawrence was one of the artists of this era. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement that emerged from the Great Migration from the South to the northern cities. The arts, literature, and music that came out of this cultural migration influenced American culture in ways that spread to the wider culture beyond Black society, and these changes are really still affecting popular culture today, like jazz, or swing, or hip-hop. It's all related. So these are a couple of paintings by Jacob Lawrence. But one of the things that's nice about the Harlem Renaissance is that there were many strong women artists also that were creating during this period and got wide acclaim. This on the left is by Lois Mailou Jones, and quite frankly, I really love her work. Look at the symbolism. She put some symbols of Egypt in here. There's an African mask. It's like she's really exploring her heritage in a way that I find quite dignified. And Jacob Lawrence has a tribute to jazz here on the right. In this painting, it's got the Cubist influence, but I can almost hear the music when I look at it. Let's look at one more by Lois Mailou Jones, just because it's a pretty cool painting. This is also, for those, there are those among us that prefer realism to abstraction. And here you can see the realist influences, but also the influences of the abstract art movement. This is a kind of art that I really enjoy, where the two are synthesized into interesting and innovative work. Now, one more woman who was a prominent artist of the Harlem Renaissance was Augusta Savage. This image on the left is just a really beautiful use of negative space, in my opinion, here. And then this one on the right is called The Ancestors. And it's a young man who is pleading for advice or something. He's pleading for something from a skeleton. I find that quite moving also because, I mean, who doesn't want to go back into the past and ask for advice when people are no longer able to give it to us because they passed on? So let's go from the Harlem Renaissance to American Gothic. I got to tell you, we have so much to cover. I'm just going to have to hop around a little bit. So that's a little bit of contrast for you. This is one of the more famous paintings in American history. It's by Grant Wood, and he was a regionalist painter. So as we discussed in the last lesson, the regionalists, they were rebelling against abstraction. They were artists who said, well, wait a minute, let's celebrate rural life. Let's celebrate the pastoral history of our country. So who are these people? This is Grant Wood's dentist, and this is the artist's sister. So they're models, and here they are posing with their painting, which I think that's a pretty wonderful photograph. One of the interesting things about this painting is that it was met with a pretty strong response, both positive and negative. Many people felt like, yeah, this celebrates our American way of life. And then other people were made uncomfortable by what felt like nationalist message. Now you have to remember, it's important to remember that this was at the same time as Germany was falling to Nazism in the time before World War II. So let's stay in the regionalist zone for a minute and return to our old favorite Thomas Hart Benton. And the reason that he's showing up in this module, he was in last week's module 2 also, is because it's very easy for people in our part of the country to see his work. Thomas Hart Benton floated the Buffalo River. In fact, he was the celebrity witness who testified before Congress and stopped the dam from being put in place in 1972. Now, many people worked on stopping the Buffalo from becoming a big lake, but Benton was the one who went to D.C., was a famous artist, and testified before Congress about the natural beauty here. Okay, so that's one of his Buffalo River paintings that we see on the left. And remember, he uses what we call the hollow and the bump in almost all of his work. That's a real characteristic of this artist's work. Here we have, it looks like Huck Finn and something else. But both of these are from the Missouri State Capitol in Jeff City. So these are huge murals that are painted in the Capitol. One of Thomas Hart Benton's most famous students was a guy named Jackson Pollock. Before we talk about that, I just want to show you this painting, which is hanging at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. It's really wonderful to look at these paintings of Thomas Hart Benton in person because you can really get a feel of how this artist worked. Okay, what about Jackson Pollock? Now, he started painting as a realistic painter, and he was working with Benton. But he rebelled. He said of Thomas Hart Benton that Benton drove his kind of realism at me so hard I bounced right into non-objective painting. So, eventually Pollock invented a revolutionary style of painting called action painting. This painting to the left is an early abstract painting of Pollock's. And let's look at what action painting looks like in action. Action painting is the process where the artist drips and splashes paint across huge canvases. Pollock used house paint, and he worked in a very spontaneous fashion. During the period from the late 1940s to the mid-50s when he did his action painting. At the same time, he was undergoing psychoanalysis, and so he was exploring the realm of his unconscious mind. Like the surrealists, Pollock believed that his art accessed the unconscious mind, and that by painting in a spontaneous fashion, he could bypass conscious thought. In viewing his work, in his belief, and maybe in our experience, we're seeing a moment in time as experienced by the artist. Pollock lived a fast-paced life, and he struggled with alcoholism. He died in a car crash at the age of 44 in 1956. The story is that he had just sold a painting for the most money that he had ever sold a painting for, $5,000. And he was riding, probably had been drinking, in his convertible sports car, and it flipped. And that, as they say, was that. Hey, let's go from action painting to pop art. Pop art is a style of art that emerged from the advertising media, popular culture, the inundation of images that was happening really ever since television in the 1950s. Pop artists were actually inspired by advertising and popular culture. They made art out of the mundane, and often in very incongruous forms, as we see in the giant clothespin by Claes Oldenburg. This sculpture was commissioned by the city of Philadelphia in honor of the bicentennial. So, according to Claes Oldenburg, the two halves of the clothespin are representing an embrace. The only way for a clothespin to work is for both halves to work together. And that's the point of this one. The sculpture above is by the popular culture artist Robert Indiana. And this has become ubiquitous in culture. In fact, there's one of these at the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art. Another work by Claes Oldenburg can be seen at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. It's the giant shuttlecock that sits in the field outside of the museum. Now here's an artist that went a little different direction. This is Roy Lichtenstein, and he was a pop artist, but he seized upon the imagery in comic strips to make his art. He took images that were usually seen in small squares in newspapers, and he made them huge, well, 4 by 6 feet. Now, in doing this, he had to change the image in order for it to read well, but he also wanted to remain true to the image. This work shows the conventions in style that must be followed for a comic to be readable by millions of people. Later, Lichtenstein applied the same practice to works by Picasso and Mondrian, reinterpreting them as comic strips. Andy Warhol is another artist from the pop art movement. He began his career in advertising. In 1960, as pop art was just emerging, he changed direction. He created art that documented popular culture rather than sold popular culture. By using the medium of silkscreen, he was able to reproduce his images in a variety of forms, although he did also use acrylic paint. His images of Marilyn Monroe represent the star, the image, rather than the human being. In Coca-Cola, he's reproduced an image that is so commonplace that it could be unnoticed. Andy Warhol felt that he wanted his art to celebrate the mundane in life. He wrote that pop artists did images that anybody walking down Broadway could recognize in a split second. And he also said all the great modern things that the abstract expressionists tried not to notice at all. In other words, he had some skepticism about abstract art, and instead he wanted to dive full force into popular culture. He had a studio called the Fun Factory, and it was really a center of the avant-garde in New York City in the 1960s, but it did fall victim to probably a little too much drug use and a little too much partying, and eventually it fell apart. Now, one more kind of pop artist, realist artist is Dwayne Hansen, and his work is delightful to me. He depicted ordinary people with exacting detail, often in a way that would poke fun at ourselves. His earlier work dealt with large social issues, but around 1970 he changed direction, saying, "You could say more with a whisper than with screaming and hollering." So he started making sculptures like this. These are sculptures that held a mirror up to aspects of American culture. We have the shoppers on the right and the tourists on the left. They kind of speak for themselves. They're both life-sized, made of polyester resin using real hair, clothes, and accessories. And when they are displayed in museums, they are often mistaken for living people. Now, ultimately, Dwayne Hansen died of probably of the result of using all of the chemicals that he used in his life. Another movement of the 20th century was realism. And here is a painting by Richard Estes, who is one of the top realist painters of the mid to late 19th century. Realism can be seen as a rebellion against the focus on abstraction in the early part of the century, but also by portraying the scene in such a non-emotional way, we also show the influence of abstraction. By showing everyday reality in minute detail, the realists hoped to get the viewer to notice these scenes in a different way. Now let's look at another realist artist, and that would be Audrey Flack. Now before you look too closely at this painting, look here. See? This is how big these paintings are. They're like 10 feet by 10 feet. So here in the smaller photograph, she's standing in front of the work that we see on the left. See the rose and how it's like about half as big as her whole body? So she would do these very realistic sort of still lives showing ordinary objects that are arranged in a way to evoke an emotional response. I find these really fascinating works. It can be fun to go through her collection, a collection of her works. Realism stayed alive throughout the century, even as art moved farther away from realistic portrayal. There were some artists, such as Andrew Wyeth, that maintained classical traditions while incorporating elements from modern art. This is Christina's World, an egg tempera painting from 1948. Egg tempera was Wyeth's primary medium. In this painting, he portrays a sense of isolation and using his precise style. There's a real, you can almost always tell an Andrew Wyeth painting because it has a certain look to it. You might not know that this artist is paralyzed from the waist down. So if you look at this painting, knowing that for her to get from where she is to the home would be a huge endeavor, it can really change how you see the painting. Now, when it was actually painted, he did use her as a model, but he put somebody else in the field, and then he just painted her, when she wasn't so far from home. This was a neighbor of his. So here we have another artist who combined realism and abstraction and is quite popular. That would be M.C. Escher. He was a Dutch artist born in 1898, and he also studied geometry. He was a printmaker and a draftsman, so all of his work is in black and white, almost all of it. Escher portrayed realistic scenes, but he almost always added an element of unreality. In his later life, he created visual puzzles using positive and negative space and playing with perspective. Sometimes in Escher's work, up is down and down is up, and it can be hard to tell what in the world is really going on. Now, earthworks were an interesting part of 1970s and 80s sculpture, maybe still somewhat to this day, but they were popular in the 70s. And this was a response to the growing influence of economics on the art scene. Some artists sought to create these huge works that could not possibly be bought or sold, working with stone, dirt, and other elements to create what we call earthworks. This is Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. It's made of rock and dirt, and it goes for 1,500 feet into the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Part of this artist's idea was to explore how the natural elements would gradually destroy his work. He thought the salty water in the lake represented the origins of all of life. Now here's the Spiral Jetty seen from the road. That's a view that I last saw in 1995. But you know what? It is still in place all these years later. It's 50 years old, and the Spiral Jetty still exists. Now we have Mies van der Rohe. When you think about 1960s architecture that had no embellishments and was pure geometry, you can primarily thank this guy. He was the person who really laid the groundwork for that kind of architecture. This is a real contrast to what we see in the earthworks. And what this artist pioneered was this minimalist way of creating buildings. His work gave way to the modern skyscraper built around a steel cage. In his work, van der Rohe believed in the maxim that less is more, and he sought to eliminate all unnecessary elements from his buildings. By the mid-1970s, this clean, modernist look threatened to strip the character from America's cities, so architects began adding elements from classical architecture back into their designs. The house above is an example of the steel cage, the minimalist style on a smaller scale. If you think about Bauhaus and you think about van der Rohe, they both have the same idea of eliminating anything that's extra and just going with the cleanest lines, usually straight lines, possible. So let's look at one more architect, and then we'll wrap it up. And that would be Frank Lloyd Wright. He's considered to be the greatest architect of the 20th century. Among his many accomplishments was the development of a style called the prairie style, which evolved into the ranch homes that fill our suburban cities to this day. Wright's houses emphasized internal spaces over external structure. He felt that there should be an openness and a continuity throughout a building. He also believed in a maxim of no posts, no columns, so he used engineering such as the cantilever to achieve this aim. And if you look here at the Falling Water House in Pennsylvania, you might be able to see that a waterfall goes actually through the house. This reflects his belief that a house should be a part of the natural world, especially this house as it was commissioned. Now you can see he also made great use of the cantilever on the balconies here. And here's an example of a cantilever where most of it is buried or supported with a counterweight and then one part sticks out. So, as art moves into the next millennium, there appears to be both a desire to return to classical principles, also a move to work with new media in order to continue to explore new territory. And in the changes of 2020, there's also a real dive into emotional expression among artists right now, as they seek to process all of the changes in the world in the last period of time. Those that are pursuing more classical styles still have the benefit of the innovations of the last 2 centuries to enhance their work, and the artists that explore new media have the knowledge that there are no limits to the possibilities of creative expression. All right, that completes this very varied and dense slideshow. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening.